Dan Acre here, Ops Manager and Weapons Curator at the Ontario Regiment Museum, located in Oshawa, Ontario. Continuing in our series of weapons, this is a 1853 Enfield rifled musket. Now, in the previous discussion, we talked about the fact that it's a smooth bore. The previous weapon was a smooth bore. Basically, it was incredibly inaccurate. Now, this is still a muzzle-loading weapon. Rifles did exist, so there is grooves cut into the barrel that allow the bullet to spin when it leaves, which makes it much more accurate. So the British actually had rifle regiments, and a number of other units had countries had rifle regiments, but rifles were extremely slow to load because rather than dropping a bullet down, you had to actually push it in so that it had good contact with the grooves. Now, there was a French officer named Minié who developed what was called the Minié bullet. And if you can imagine basically a bullet with a bullet shape but with sort of a thimble-like bottom in which there was a hollow space. What would happen is the Minié bullet, when you loaded it, as discussed, you put the powder down, you take the bullet down. When the powder goes off, the cavity at the bottom of the round expands and comes in contact with the grooves, so it spins. So the rifling allows the bullet to go down range, which gives you a much more accurate weapon, at least for the few initial volleys. So the rifled musket was a major impact in terms of the infantry accuracy when firing. Now, you still had two issues. Number one, after you fired the weapon, you still had the cloud of smoke. That's why you would also read a number of accounts in the American Civil War that once a volley was fired, the officer would drop to the ground and look along the ground to see the impact of the fire. Because especially after the second or third volley where you have a cloud of smoke in front of you and you're basically firing into the smoke, unless there was a wind, the smoke's going to sit there in front of you. The officer had to look down to see what the impact was. So this weapon actually allowed you to fire farther. So again, the whole concept was exactly the same. You just basically, initially you had a striker, but by this time you were using brass caps. So it was sort of like a small brass thimble that you would put on the top, and that would be the ignition. Now, this allowed you not to worry too much about rain when it was firing, because as we talked with the earlier muskets that had a flintlock mechanism, if it was raining and your powder got wet, sometimes it would not ignite, which meant you had a misfire, which was an issue. So your rifle was basically useful as a club or a spear if the bayonet was involved. So this was a very useful weapon. In fact, very popular weapon. The Americans loved it or the British loved it, more importantly, because they were selling these. Over 1 million, I think 1.8 million were sold during the Civil War to both sides during the U.S. Civil War by the British. A very large step forward in infantry firepower. Thank you.